Have you ever felt overwhelmed by all the numbers in your blood work results and wondered which ones actually matter? In today's episode, I'm going to break down the 5 essential blood work numbers that you need to know, what healthy ranges look like, and how to improve those numbers if they're out of balance. By the end of this episode, you're going to have a clear understanding of which numbers to focus on and actionable steps to optimize your health. Before we dive in, if you're listening on the Apple Podcast app or on Spotify, be sure to hit the follow button. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button down below. Today, I'm really excited to dive into the 5 essential blood work numbers. Now, before I dive into anything, I want to give a disclosure that this episode today is not medical advice. I am not a doctor. I am not a licensed medical practitioner. I am simply a certified fitness trainer and certified nutrition coach who has learned a lot about this stuff through my own experience, through doing my own lab work, and through my own personal research. So this is not medical advice. If you are getting blood work done and you need professional advice, go see a doctor. But I think that oftentimes some people get it and they never follow up with their doctor because they don't even know what their lab work is actually telling them. So I want to give you guys a little bit of a glimpse in my understanding of what are some of the most important blood work numbers that you should be looking at, what range, what numbers, like what number ideally that would be, what ranges those would be in, I should say, and then what you can do to actually improve the numbers if they're not in the ideal ranges currently. Again, this is not medical advice. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a licensed medical practitioner. So go get medical advice from your doctor if these numbers are out of range on your own. But I'm going to start off by telling you the 5 numbers and talking about just very briefly what they are. Again, I'm not going to dive into the deep science into every single one of these, what they actually are. You can do some of your own research and ask your doctor about that. But 5 of the blood work numbers that you need to know are the following. The first is going to be your fasting blood glucose. And this is simply going to be how much blood sugar that you actually have in your blood after having not eaten anything for 8 to 12 hours. So that is your fasting blood glucose numbers. The second is your blood pressure, and blood pressure is pretty simple. It's the force of your blood pushing against the walls of your arteries as your heart pumps blood throughout your body. And there's 2 numbers that you're going to get, the systolic and the diastolic numbers. The systolic number is the essentially amount of pressure your blood is pressing up with against your arteries when your heart is beating. And then the diastolic number is the amount of pressure that your blood is pushing up against your arteries when it's at rest. So systolic over diastolic is when your heart is beating versus when it's at rest. So what is the pressure that the blood is pressing up against with your arteries? Then the third is going to be fasting triglycerides. Fasting triglycerides. So triglycerides are essentially a type of fat, and we're looking at how much fat is essentially circulating in your blood. Next is going to be your HDL cholesterol. This is what's often called your healthy cholesterol, but it's essentially taking cholesterol, removing excess cholesterol from your blood and from your body. Then the last one, that this 5th number, is not a blood work number, but it's your waist circumference. So that is essentially just how far around in inches your waist is. Now, those 5 numbers, why are those 5 numbers really critical? Because those 5 numbers are what help determine whether or not you have metabolic syndrome. Those 5 numbers are looked at by doctors and medical professionals to determine whether or not they, quote, diagnose you with metabolic syndrome. And right now, if my understanding is correct, is that if you have 3 out of 5, at least 3 out of 5 of those numbers that are in the unhealthy ranges that they determine, then it's determined that you have metabolic syndrome. And very briefly, what metabolic syndrome actually means, for the most part, simply put, is that your cells are what's called insulin resistant. And I've talked about this before on the podcast. We've talked about it with different guests, but very quickly, your cells, when you eat food, glucose comes into your body, and your body wants to then use that for energy. And so glucose goes into the bloodstream, and then we want to be able to bring that glucose into the cell so that the cell can can use it as energy. And so, but something has to bring that glucose in the bloodstream into the cell. And that's where the pancreas secretes insulin. And so insulin is essentially the thing that helps bring glucose from the bloodstream into the cell to be used for energy. And when we have healthy cells, we are said to be insulin sensitive, and that's a good thing. Insulin sensitive means that insulin does its job of bringing glucose into the cell to be used for energy. When we are insulin resistant, we are essentially saying that our cells are unhealthy and that insulin is not able to bring glucose into the cells to be used for energy. And so there is excess glucose out in the bloodstream, and that can bring on a whole bunch of negative side effects. And so if we are said to have metabolic syndrome, mainly my understanding of what that means is that we have insulin resistance, and so our cells are unhealthy. And if we have 3 out of 5 of these numbers that are not in the ranges that we want them to be in, then we are said to have metabolic syndrome. Now, from what I have read, the following ranges are what determine whether or not you have metabolic syndrome. And then other people talk about what really the ideal ranges are. So I'm going to talk about those as well. So if you're taking notes because you're going to get blood work, or you've gotten blood work, or you want to get blood work, then I would really write these down. So we're going to start off with fasting blood glucose. If you have metabolic syndrome, you're said to be in the range of 111 to 125. If you're just insulin resistant, then you're going to be above 100. You want to be below 100 to be good, and ideal is somewhere between 70 and 85. And this is milligrams per deciliter. But again, for the sake of you getting your blood work report back, it's just going to say these numbers. So ideal would be 70 to 85. If we have metabolic syndrome, we're in about 111 to 125. For blood pressure, you have metabolic syndrome if you're 130 over 85, and then you're healthy if you're anywhere between 90 over 60 to 120 over 80. Next, for fasting triglycerides, you're said to have metabolic syndrome if you are above 150. Below 150 is what a lot of people say is good. A lot of people say 75 to 125 is ideal, and then some people say that below 80 is really ideal. Now, when I say some people say, one of the books that I've just am finishing up reading right now is called Good Energy: The Surprising Connection Between Metabolism and Limitless Health by Casey Means and her brother Callie Means. And I've been listening to them on podcasts, and I've read this book. And this isn't the first time that I've heard these numbers when reading this book. I've heard these numbers plenty of times in other places, but this book was the inspiration for recording this podcast. And they say that below 80 is ideal for your fasting triglycerides. And I really do believe that triglycerides, especially when it comes to your cholesterol panel, is one of the most correlated numbers when it comes to heart disease. The next number is going to be your HDL cholesterol. For men, you are said to have metabolic syndrome if you are less than 40. Women, you are said to have metabolic syndrome if you're less than 50. And you ideally just want to have above those numbers. Now, if you want to look more ideal, the higher, the better for the most part. I think there's some people who say if you get to a certain number up really, really high, then maybe there's some negative side effects. But what they have in Good Energy is 50 to 90 is going to be ideal. And then lastly, when it comes to waist circumference, what I have learned to be diagnosed as metabolic syndrome is men if you're greater than 40 inches with your waist, and women if you're greater than 35. Now, there's also a ratio that I like to bring about with some people is I like to use a waist to height ratio, especially for those people who are super tall, because some people who are just really, really tall but have a wide waist aren't necessarily overweight, if you will. So this ratio is your waist in inches compared to your height in inches. And healthy is anywhere from 0.4 to 0.49. Less than 0.4 says you're underweight. Greater than 0.5 says you're overweight. Now, again, I know there was just a bunch of numbers right there. And so if you really want to get the most out of this episode, you're going to have to write those numbers down. So I hope you guys can either pause it throughout the episode, go back, rewind, write those numbers down. Those are what are said to be the ideal numbers, the good numbers, and the numbers that have you in being considered as metabolic syndrome. Now, again, what is considered metabolic syndrome is if you have 3 out of 5 of those numbers in the range of metabolic syndrome that I read out. Now, I want to kind of transition into how do we actually improve these numbers? Like if we go get our blood work done and these numbers are not in the ideal ranges, what can we do through our diet, lifestyle, exercise in order to improve those numbers so we can optimize our health? Because before I even dive into that quite yet, I want to zoom out really quickly because a lot of people think when it comes to being healthy, if you're not overweight, you're in good health. That's what a lot of people think. They think that health is simply dictated by what I can see on the surface. If that person is, quote, skinny or not fat, then that person is healthy. That is not the case. Even if somebody looks good and is super, super fit, but they have no idea what their blood work numbers could be showing that there's some really detrimental health issues that they might be having. And so it's really important to look at health as a whole. Yes, part of health is how you look. Part of health is how you feel. Part of health is your blood work. Part of health is your fitness levels. Part of health is your mental health. There's so many things that we need to be looking at when it comes to evaluating our overall health. It is not just what you can see on the surface. And so when I'm coaching people in the 10-week transformation, I kind of coach people that you can have a few different kinds of goals. Yes, of course, you can have a body composition goal. Then you can have a performance goal. Essentially, how much can you lift? How fast can you run? There's obviously limitless levels of performance goals. And then the third kind of goal you can have is going to be a blood work goal. What numbers are you trying to move the needle on when it comes to your blood work? So again, when it comes to setting goals in your health, it can be a body composition goal, a fitness performance goal, and then a blood work goal. Okay, so now let's transition into how to improve these numbers. The first way to improve these numbers, basically any of these, is going to be eliminate processed foods. Processed foods are stripped of their fiber, and they jack up your blood sugar and cause you to overeat and store excess body fat, especially visceral fat. So again, when a food is stripped of its fiber, one, it's going to increase your blood sugar spike post-meal. Now, always anytime we eat a meal, our blood sugar is going to go up. But the size of that glucose spike post-meal is important. You don't want to have it as crazy dramatic as possible. You want to have it as gentle waves, if you will, as you go throughout the day. When you have a big spike, then that's going to be followed by a big crash. And that's oftentimes why we feel depleted with our energy. And it's not necessarily that those big spikes and those big crashes are going to necessarily negatively impact your health in the short term. Yeah, they might negatively impact your energy in the short term, but it's in the long term. These huge fluctuations are what are huge drivers of poor health outcomes and diseases, etc. And then another thing is when we eat processed foods that are stripped of fiber, then we're not going to be getting as full as we would normally be doing because we're not getting the nutrients that our body actually wants. Therefore, our satiety signals or our fullness signals are not being triggered. Therefore, that's causing us to overeat. Therefore, that's causing us to store more excess body fat, therefore having higher triglyceride levels. So eliminating processed foods is step number one to improve really any of these blood work numbers. Step number two is going to be eating well-balanced meals. Now, especially meals that are high in fiber and meals that are high in high quality protein and healthy fats. Again, when it comes to managing your blood sugar levels on a daily basis, it's not necessarily a huge deal. It might play a role in your energy levels, but when it comes to major spikes and major crashes over time throughout your life, that's what's going to cause negative health outcomes. And so if we can have well-balanced meals, then our blood sugar spikes and crashes are not going to be near as severe. So when we think about building out a meal, when we look at our plate, we want to ensure that we've got a high-quality protein, we've got fiber, and we've got some healthy fats. That'll really ensure that your blood sugar levels are stable, also not causing you to overeat, therefore also not causing you to gain excess body fat. So eat well-balanced meals. Third is exercise. And just generally speaking, obviously exercise is going to help improve any and all of these numbers, but more specifically when it comes to some of these like specific things, if you can go on a walk or do some sort of movement before and after your meals, it is shown to decrease the amount of your blood sugar spike after your meal. So if you have some sort of movement or some sort of exercise, again, it can just be some body weight squats. It can be just some push-ups. It can be some jumping jacks. It can be a 10-minute walk outside before or after your meal, but that will help to improve your blood sugar levels as you go throughout your day and as you go throughout your weeks, your month, and your life, obviously, as well. Number 4 is to really prioritize sleep. Sleep is one of the biggest factors when it comes to not being able to manage your blood sugar levels well. And so if we can get a high quality 7+ hours of sleep, as much as we possibly can, that's going to be a huge driver in improving your blood work numbers. And then 5th and finally is your stress. Stress levels are also a driver when it comes to spiking your blood sugar. It's one of those things where one person could eat the same exact food at the same exact time, but if they do it after a good night of sleep versus a bad night of sleep, their blood sugar is going to be different. Same thing with stress. They could eat the same thing at the same time on the same day of the week, but if at one time they're really, really stressed out and a different time they're not stressed out at all, their blood sugar response is going to be different. And so if we can implement different stress management practices during our day, that's going to help with our blood work numbers as well. So again, and a little bit of a recap, if you guys are taking notes, the 5 numbers that people are going to look at, doctors are going to look at to determine whether or not you have metabolic syndrome, whether or not your cells are unhealthy, and whether or not you are insulin resistant are your fasting blood glucose, your blood pressure, your fasting triglycerides, your HDL cholesterol, and your waist circumference. And let's go through just the ideal ranges for those. For fasting blood glucose, you want 70 to 85. For blood pressure, anywhere from 90 over 60 to 120 over 80. For fasting triglycerides, it's going to be the lower the better. If you're under 125, you're pretty darn good. If you're under 80, that's even better. HDL cholesterol, generally speaking, the higher the better. In Good Energy by Casey and Callie Means, they say 50 to 90 is where you really want to be. And then lastly, with your waist circumference, I think about the ratio of your waist to your height. And so healthy is going to be 0.4 to 0.49 of a waist in inches to a height in inches ratio. And then if you're under 0.4, that's underweight. Over 0.5 is overweight. So those are the numbers we need to be looking at. I know for me, I'm trying to approach my health from a much more holistic manner. I know growing up, it was all about fitness. It was all about physique. It was always about looking a certain way or performing a certain way. But now it's like, I'm almost 30 years old. I just got married. I am thinking about having kids in the future. I'm thinking longer term. I'm like, I want to make sure that I am proactively going about these things, because so many people don't start looking at this stuff until they're 40, 50, 60, 65 years old. And at that point, it's not necessarily too late, but you're not going to be able to move the needle as much as you probably could have, because a lot of these numbers are not necessarily a result of you just over the past year not taking care of your health. It's your last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years not taking care of your health. And so no matter how old you are, if you're listening, it is never too late. But the younger you are, the more you have the ability to positively impact these numbers as you go throughout your life. So I hope you took this to heart. I hope you wrote down the numbers so that you know next time you get blood work what ranges you should be in. I hope you wrote down the things, the habits, the lifestyle, the nutrition that you should be doing in order to optimize those numbers as you go throughout your life. I hope today was insightful. Again, disclosure, I am not a doctor. I am not a licensed medical practitioner. I'm simply a fitness trainer, a nutrition coach who is wanting to help you get a more holistic view at your health and be able to be proactive along your health journey. Make sure you're subscribing to this podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, make sure you hit that follow button right now so that you are notified of the new episodes coming up, because I'm continuing to provide you guys with some of the highest level content that there is out there on the internet. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button down below. But more than anything, I hope today helps you guys get closer to your health and fitness goals. And ultimately, I hope it gets you closer and closer to your best you.